Welcome, everybody. This morning's conversation is going to be about the path towards student success innovation that's happening in the world of higher education. And we're going to talk about the role of catalytic players in that. Those catalytic players is a family of players that make this work. And one of the key players, set of key players, is around the foundation world. In 2006, Warren Buffett made an announcement that kind of shook the world when he told everybody he was going to give $31 billion away, actually $37 billion in total. He said basically all of these resources I do not need. I'm going to give this away over the course of the next 15, 20 years into charity, and $31 billion of that went to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. People couldn't figure out, they couldn't wrap their head around what this was about, and one of the things he said is, what I've seen is that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is really good at targeting what they want to do and making the kind of difference that I want to make. So I'm going to partner with them, and we're going to stand together and see if these resources can help make a difference to solve some big problems. He was very focused on two things, very focused on helping find cures for infectious diseases that were wiping people out, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, India, and other places. And his second big priority was education. And in particular, he was focused on education and the poverty dynamics and how to change poverty dynamics in the United States. Thus began a conversation with the Gates Foundation about something beyond the College Ready Initiative. The College Ready Initiative was focused on K-12 at the time, all focused on trying to get 80% of high school graduates college ready by the time they graduated, which, by the way, was a huge goal because high schools were never created with college readiness in mind. And so it was changing an entire field towards college readiness, which was a big, big deal. They had spent close to $1.4 billion in that work. And now they began to think, are there other things we can do in the world of education that can make a difference? And they brought in Hillary Pennington. And Hillary Pennington came from Jobs for the Future, and she assembled a group of people to do almost a year's worth of research, in particular around poverty dynamics and how education can play in poverty dynamics. And the one kind of stunning finding out of that work was the kind of persistent and consistent finding that social mobility in the United States had stalled. Not only had it stalled, it is starting to go the other direction. And in fact, the finding that kind of hit Bill and Melinda Gates between the eyes was the finding that never in our history as a country have you been more likely to die poor if you were born poor. Anybody else see that as a problem? Yeah. It became a kind of real sticking point and talking point, and the researchers started diving deeper to figure out what could be the catalytic change. It's one of the things the Gates Foundation is famous for, is trying to find the lever, the catalyst work that they could as a foundation to try to change that dynamic. And all kinds of poverty experts came to the table and talked about the things that they could be doing. And after almost a year's worth of analysis, the finding that came out was that the biggest and most catalytic thing the foundation could do was to try to help young people, especially between the ages of 16 and 26, achieve, and listen to this phrasing, a post-secondary credential with labor market value. Okay? The problem with that phrasing, by the way, the data was incontrovertible. If you get a young person especially, but actually returning adults work as well, but especially young people, if you can get them a post-secondary credential with labor market value by the time they're 26, and beyond, it actually not only changes their lives, it changes whose life? Their kids, their extended family. It's a ripple effect. It actually creates this community effect for these kind of folks. I experienced it in my own life. I come from a family of 9 kids. I actually have an African-American brother, a Native American brother, and a Korean sister. In addition to that, I had 25 foster kids who rotated through my home during the time I was growing up. My mom was a special needs nurse, and my dad was out of his mind. So big, rowdy household. I was the first one in my family to go on a higher ed journey. I started at Mesa Community College in Arizona. And if it wasn't for Mesa Community College, I would not be standing here today. Literally, the faculty and staff of that institution changed my life, changed the trajectory of my life. When I started there, I didn't know what an AA was. I didn't know what an AS was. I kind of knew what BS was, right? Because I was faking it. And I can name the faculty members who scaffolded me and helped me get on the path towards higher education. And what was fascinating was, after I got through there and got my bachelor's at ASU, my master's at ASU, went to UT Austin and got my doctorate, almost every single one of my siblings got a college degree after that. And part of it was my family really got to the point of saying, well, if Mark can do it, anybody can do it, right? Well, let's get on that path, right? So you see that ripple effect. And so when they got to that finding of the post-secondary credential with labor market value being the game changer, they got super excited about starting a post-secondary initiative. Now the real problem is helping America's youth obtain a post-secondary credential with labor market value does not fit really well on a bumper sticker, right? It's not a great communication tool. And a whole family of conversations started around, people assumed that meant we want 4-year degrees for everybody. Is that what that phrase means? No, what that phrase meant was the family of post-secondary credentials. It means certifications, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, the family, and especially creating trajectories where people could move up and move on, right? So they could earn a certificate, get another certificate, get an associate, from the associates get a bachelor's, and keep the pathways open for people. And so the whole conversation started, and the launch of the post-secondary initiative really took shape in 2009, 2010. Our guest today, Dan Greenstein, came in about 7 years ago to this work. And part of his job was to start looking in more depth about how we can continue to catalyze this movement. And in particular, how we could take this conversation around completion and flesh it out. Because I think the first phase of the initiative did this amazing work of getting the completion agenda on the table, and then it began to open up and look much broader at what completion to what end and what that looked like. And it was amazing to watch Dan work and pull a team together to look at the technology supports, the wraparound supports, to look at the strategy, and to look at the networks. And what's going to be really great today in this conversation is we're going to be able to spend some time picking his brain about what's working, what we're seeing, what kind of dynamics are happening, but also what's on the road ahead. So let's give a big round of applause to Dan. Come on up. So Dan, thanks for taking the time to come in for the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
So we began that setup with the conversation around one of the first things the post-secondary strategy the Gates Foundation did was to try to change the conversation. American higher education had been an amazing access innovator, had tried to open the doors to lots of people. But the data that really hit them between the eyes was not only the poverty dynamic, but the fact that only a little over half of the people who started were finishing, and that it was radically disparate based on income level. So the idea was, we have to start taking completion seriously. People have to start thinking about finishing what they start. But completion's not enough, and I'd love for you to unpack that a bit about how the conversation has matured in some ways beyond just the notion of completion.
Yeah, no, that's great, and thanks for that introduction. It's interesting because I think if you go back to like the Second World War, the education public policy in this country has been heroic. It has democratized the face of education. In 50 years, we have changed the face of education so that the student body is much more, not completely, but much more like the public of the United States of America. Access to higher education has in effect democratized higher education. And then the challenge that was revealed in the data, as you pointed out, is that getting into college wasn't enough. That in fact there was a huge disconnect between, and it was measurable in terms of income as well as race, ethnicity.
In fact, the assumption was that if you got them into college, you did your
enough.
job.
That was enough. Yeah. And in some ways, you know, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it didn't really matter because the public support for higher education was so high. The price point was relatively low. The risk of going to college for a little bit and not finishing was not that high. You could go into, I grew up in Rochester, New York, where it was very normal in fact, most kids from my high school went into a job at Kodak without going on to college, and that was a very reliable pathway into the middle class. And increasingly, as the price of higher education goes up, the price that students pay, and the number of alternative pathways into the middle class begin to diminish, the pressure on higher education to deliver as a pathway into the middle class becomes higher. And that's when this completion movement really began to take off. Frankly, I think as early as 2006 with the Spellings, who's beginning to get concerned about data and accountability, exposing the fact that there's these gross inequities not in access, but in terms of completion.
And what's interesting is it kind of paralleled what happened in the healthcare world, because as the healthcare world started getting access to more data, they realized that the number 3 killer of people in the US turned out to be medical errors. And it started a whole movement around the checklist manifesto and trying to fix the patient experience. And now we're seeing a parallel in our world around the student experience, and that's a big part of the conversation for you all.
Yeah, and it's super interesting because you can look at this a million different ways. At the end of the day, we've landed on the fact that the college, this is going to sound really internal, you'll appreciate this. Mark used to work at Gates, he didn't say that. So if we begin to slip into some Gatesies kind of language, call us out and say, what are you talking about? But we talk about where's the locus point? Where are you looking to change? If you're going to try to improve students' lives, students' ability to acquire a credential that'll get them into a reasonable career and a sustaining life, where's the lever, as you pointed out? And we landed on the fact that it's really the college. Colleges are the sources of degrees. So if you're going to improve the situation, you've got to support colleges in getting better, in serving their students better, in reaching more deeply into the pool, enrolling more students who have historically been underserved by college, low-income students, students of color, first-gen students, adult students, enrolling more of them and ensuring that they're retained. So our focus has been on, go where the students are. And that's pretty much where we have stuck. There's alternatives out there, as you know. I mean, there's a lot of interest in alternative kinds of credentials that are offered often in the commercial
Code
marketplace.
academies, badges, whatever it might be.
General Assembly, et cetera. And not a bad idea, but if you think of, this is a numbers game, right? We estimate that by 2025, the U.S. economy will require 11 million more credentialed students than colleges can produce. 11 million more credentials, about a 5% compound annual growth rate. People, raise your hands in the audience if your college is on track to increase your credentialing productivity 5% a year on year. And that's the problem, because I get that answer everywhere I go, except from WGU. When Western Governors is in the room, but that's not right. That's not enough in and of itself. That becomes the national.
So part of the strategy from the beginning has been this combination of reach and impact, right?
Yep.
So trying to help more and more diverse students access higher education effectively, but you can't do reach without doing the impact work, because the numbers don't work.
Yep.
And so part of the impact work is you have to help more and more diverse students be radically successful. And the challenges in the world of higher education is, especially the first generation and low income students, are the students we've been historically the worst at helping get across the finish line.
Yeah, and if you think about it, look, the incentive, the business model, if I can say that, for higher education until about a decade ago was enrollment, right? It was enrollment on census day. You were paid because of enrollment on census day. So the idea was to get them in, not to get them out. Increasingly, that's no longer the case. In certain places, Florida's one, there's outcomes-based funding, which is all about outcomes. But increasingly, there is also pressure from students who are recognizing that the cost of higher education is super high. The opportunity cost is super high. And so this idea that, and you're beginning to see it in the public discourse, which is beginning to become increasingly skeptical about the value of a higher education, even though the data suggests that it still adds value in terms of your earning potential. And that adds an additional pressure on colleges to think more and harder about how to serve students, particularly the historically underserved, how to serve them better.
And I think what's been interesting about the maturing of this movement is the conversation began with four-year college for all, and people got off that quickly and said, no, completion is about much broader credentials. But now people are realizing it's completion to what end? What did they learn while they were there? And then are they ready to actually, do they have the resources to be socially mobile, right? To have a sense of efficacy and agency, but then also to have economic choices. And that's definitely seeping into your conversations.
Yeah, I think the question is, it is completion for what? And then it sort of forces us with our partners to think about, okay, what are the kinds of pathways that you're building through college into a career? Which is tough to do. It requires a degree, and you all know this, I don't need to say it, it requires a degree of flexibility and nimbleness at the college, because local economies they're dynamic. And higher education is dynamic too, but maybe is it the sine waves? They move, the troughs are a little wider. They move at a different pace. And somehow we're going to have to adjust for that, and become more nimble and more flexible and somehow more integrated with our, when I say local economies, they can be regional, statewide, they can be national, depending on the institution, but how can we resonate more with the kinds of employer groups that we are serving so that we can serve them better? And that's not, by the way, me saying that we're commoditizing higher education and making it all about jobs. That's not the case. However, if you survey American adults and student populations and poll after poll, the first reason students go to college is, and to ignore that because somehow it offends our sense of the liberal arts, doesn't seem to me to make sense. How to actually have both seems to be a
And again, what's interesting about that is that in the end, it's about the student having a sense of power, right? They have their own choices. They have economic opportunities to either start a company, work for somebody, but they have those options because of that. The challenge has been the likelihood of somebody coming into our system and actually being able to succeed on the other side. And I'd love to have you reflect on the kind of changing, because the conversation has shifted and people are looking more broadly at completion and at broader student sets, we're starting to finally see a shift in big policy regimes around this. So for example, for the last 30 years, higher ed policy has bent themselves around first-time, full-time fall freshmen,
Right.
because that is what has been the coin of the realm for IPEDS.
Right.
And so even as the completion agenda took off,
Yeah.
everybody was talking about first-time, full-time fall freshmen. We just did a community insights report at Civitas, and the kind of the catchphrase of it was to serve all students, you have to see all students. And in the realization of how many part-time students, returning students, students who need different kinds of schedules, and who are going to come with 30 credits from a dual enrollment initiative. They're not going to show up as first-time, full-time. And if we're going to see all that, then we have to change the reporting regimes. And we just got a shift in IPEDS where they're looking at transfer students and they're looking at some of the returning. Some of that's going to change the dynamic here, don't you think?
Yeah. What's interesting is that if you think about colleges and how they've operated, they have taken a very nuanced approach to their treatment of students. They don't treat all students the same. It's a very segmented approach, if I can say that, to the marketplace. One treats extension students, one delivers somewhat different kind of a service to an extension student than one would to a first-time freshman graduating directly from high school, and there's a different set of experiences and supports surrounding a transfer student. I think that will improve. Those segmented approaches to understanding different student groups and their needs will get better and sharper. It will need to, and I think the data will actually help drive in that regard.
Yeah. Well, talk to me a bit, because I know the philanthropic community has been a big part of doing strategic advocacy work to get these policy frameworks going, right? Yeah. So we've always had performance-based funding. Don't kid yourself. The performance before was access. Yeah. So people looked at enrollment. Yeah. Now we're kind of looking at broader performance metrics. As the world of philanthropy continues to think about how they can pull these levers, when you look at the broad family of kind of major philanthropists, Gates Foundation, Lumina Foundation, Kresge, Strata, and others, and then all the state-based foundations that are doing this work, the energy around this completion and kind of social mobility movement isn't going away. It's actually kind of ratcheting up a bit, but they're definitely trying to hit it from different angles, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the different funders bring a different sort of emphasis and flavor. What's exciting to me, though, is we're beginning to see, I'm going to say coalescence around a handful of things that apparently work better than other things. And when I say coalescence, I mean agreement amongst practitioners and experts in the field and thought leaders and researchers. And you can see it in this state. You can see it in approaches to developmental education. Yeah. You can see it in new approaches to advising. The approaches that use platforms that sort of support advising through predictive analytics. You can see it increasingly in the conversations around high-impact teaching practices, right? And what is and when you see coalescence happening, it tends to bring funders together. So a good example is a group that's sort of managed by the Education Commission of the States. Yeah. It was pulled together around a dozen or so institutions who had been involved in dev ed reform for decades, who'd finally agreed a set of evidence-based practices that were really beginning to demonstrate positive results. The use of a co-requisite model, right. The use of multiple measures in placing students in developmental education, the use of alternative math pathways in particular. And you see that coalescence beginning to emerge in the field. Guess what happens? The funders pile in behind it. States begin to pile in behind it. You're seeing the same thing now in the two-year space in the so-called pathways movement, which are highly structured, guided pathways. Get a student on a pathway that's well-designed, well-structured, tailored to meet that student's particular education and career goal, and help them stay on that path. That's gone viral in the two-year space. Jerry Brown just put $120 million into pathways work in the state of California. Yeah. We're seeing similar kinds of investments being. So this coalescence, this sort of the emergence of well-defined evidence-based practices that are lifted up by experts in the community, not by foundations. Our work, frankly, and I would speak for some of my colleagues, peers as well, is helping communities reach those definitions, to be clear about what it is they're talking about so they can have a conversation with each other. When you talk about dev ed reform, what do you really mean? And then to build the kind of measurement framework and do the research that can then replicate good data about evidence and how these things are going to work. When you see that beginning to happen, there's a rush on a number of fronts. Institutions beginning to pile in, seeing that here in Florida, in a variety of areas. Funders beginning to pile in, critically states beginning to pile in. And it's movement building. And it has a hockey stick-like kind of cadence. Starts out, or if you like, it's the takeoff trajectory out of Orange County Airport. Takes off
straight up,
and then it goes flat 1,000 feet, and then it goes up again. So we're seeing that hockey stick effect, I think, increasingly in many areas.
What's interesting about the kind of the list of things you rattled off is that we are seeing, of course, the coalescence around remedial developmental education work. The coalescence in particular around pathways is taking off. Competency-based learning is really kind of, and as that evidence base is growing, what's interesting is 7-8 years ago, all of those things were being done at small scale in places, outside of Western governors with competency-based. But now people are now adopting dev ed reforms across the entire institution. They're doing pathway work across the entire institution. They're actually rolling out different kinds of technology supports, advising supports for the entire institution. And that's been a big part of your strategy is to get people. Higher education's famous for random acts of innovation, right? You go to institutions, and we're also famous for the case method, copy and steal everything. We go to conferences like this, and we pull idea. And what we've seen in our careers for decades is that every institution that thinks it's on top will say, well, I've got one of those, I've got one of those, I've got one of those, and none of them were at scale. But that's been a big part of your strategy, was to challenge people to say, okay, do a number of things, figure out what you think works, and then bet on them bigger. And talk a little bit about how that conversation has gone and how you're leaning into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really over the arc of the work. I mean, it's been, first of all, trying to sort of lean in on lifting up the things that work. We're really, all right, only one of my colleagues is here, and she will not take this back to my, what are they, I could also say, what are they going to do, fire me, right? So our work has been kind of on the geeky side, is to really help communities establish taxonomy so they can distinguish the features of a dev ed reform or whatever, so that they can have a common conversation about things that seem to work, and then measurement frameworks that allow you to replicably test and then comparably test the kind of efficacy, cost, and outcomes from any particular set of interventions. And with that common definition, common use of data, you can begin to see that coalescence happen. As that's begun to happen, we've begun to withdraw from, I'm going to say, pure innovation. We'll always do work in innovation, super important, and investing more in replication and scale, right? Because, even in my time, 6 years, when I started, the question was, what do we do? Now the question is, we know what to do, why aren't you doing it, right? And so we're beginning to turn our investments into putting in place the supports that enable the next institution to have the same kind of success that FSU is having in advising, or that Arizona and UCF are having in online learning.
And scale and impact innovation are different, right? The impact innovation is what's working. The scale innovation is how do you get it to more people? Which is interesting. It's parallel in many ways to the maternal health work that's been done in Africa out of the foundation, because they did a lot of work around the maternal health findings, but then they had to really do the work around how do you scale that? How do you get more of that happening?
And scale's hard. Innovation is not easy. Scale is hard. Innovation is like, there's a good idea, let's do that, right? But replication is really requiring a degree of sensitivity to the fact that not all colleges are the same, that not every widget fits into the same widget holder. All right, I've stretched that analogy way too far. That context matters, that you have to provide implementation supports that are meaningful in different settings. You have to recognize the human talent, the human capacity, the human capability, and any different college is going to be different. You have to support change agency, which is super hard in any industry.
And just support the learning. The idea of it's okay to fail, and part of this is to understand what doesn't work and try to stop doing that. And you've been pretty transparent about a number of the things the foundation has tried, just haven't worked the way you wanted them to work, right? You might want to share a little bit about the fact that that's actually kind of a badge of honor within the foundation to kind of lay that out there.
Yeah, I was told when I was hired by Jeff Rakes, the then CEO, he said, "You don't ever fail. You only fail if you don't learn." which meant being transparent also about the learning
Right.
internally. Yeah, we have done things that have not worked as well or had not worked as well. Competency-based education is a great example. It's not that we found it very difficult to, with a community of practice, to actually develop a clear understanding, definitional understanding of what competency-based education was that wasn't simply a counter-distinction to the credit hour.
Right.
And so we struggled a little bit with some high-impact teaching practices because you'd sit in meetings of very earnest, well-meaning teaching and learning professionals who were enthusiastic about high-impact practices, but had very difficult time distinguishing their characteristics, coming up with a taxonomy of practices and knowing which of them are actually useful, and even how do you define them.
Defining great teaching and how do you scale great teaching, right?
Yeah. Assessments of learning outcomes, just really looked into that arena. Incredibly difficult because of the politics around learning outcomes assessment. Is it the right place for a foundation to be? So there's any number of false starts, and the other thing I think which is worth mentioning is that a false start isn't just something that happens not beginning and ending in 6 months. It takes a longish time to know whether a potential portfolio is likely to bear fruit. There's a real, it's not science, it's art, to know when to dial out. Because it's easy to do it too soon.
Yeah.
And it's easy to do it too late. And, you know, Baby Bear just isn't there when you want it to be to provide the acid test. But
Yeah, and there's always a real risk of ripping up the plant to look at the roots, right? And realizing, ooh, I just destroyed the process, right?
Yeah. I will give you an example. I've shared this publicly, so I'll share it here. So we had a project called Completion by Design, which, through the arc of our work, we started looking very much at specific interventions that could help students get through better through higher education. So we looked at advising reform, we looked at DevEd, we looked at online learning, we looked at a handful of other things. Through that learning, we recognized that the institutions that were really knocking it out of the park and eliminating attainment gaps and increasing their credentialing, productivity, and just doing a lot better weren't intervention-based places. They were pretty fundamentally transforming their entire operating model. And that became, okay, that's a whole new strategy. Yeah, the interventions are interesting, but now what's even more interesting is surrounding those high performers and saying, what the heck are you doing? And can we extract lessons from what you're doing that others can follow? So our first stab at that was an initiative called Completion by Design, which was 9 two-year colleges in Ohio, Florida, and North Carolina.
North Carolina, Washington State.
Yeah. And so Completion by Design was, it was completion by design. It was a whole enterprise-wide approach to that involved student pathways and advising and DevEd. It was just a holistic approach to sort of creating a student-centered experience at these colleges. And it was a 7-year initiative, maybe another couple of years in the planning phase. And we'd sit there year on year and we'd look at the data coming out of the colleges and we would hope they're gonna get better, right? Even the leading indicators are gonna get better. And not so much for a while. And all I can say is they showed an uptick at just the right time. Like 5 years in, we began to see
The major uptick.
And then of course the hockey stick effect.
Right.
And it testifies to everything. In fact, in some of the colleges, you actually saw a diminishing, the data showing decline in performance, because sometimes when you're changing things, you're actually making it harder to perform well. And so, that conditioned us, and no surprise that change is hard and change is slow. Yeah. And so having the patient capital to wait, and that's true at the intervention level, that's true at the enterprise level. And it's, I think you all know that as working in higher ed, you don't just get up one day and say, okay, now we're gonna do this, and the next day it's done. Change is hard.
What's interesting about using the completion by design example is that it was this idea of broad organizational practice plus policy cover, right, to kind of make it work. And it did take a while, and suddenly you saw the uptick. And it really was, in many ways, the predicate of the pathway movement, because people learned from that about the notion of kind of broader kind of pathways. But even for things like, the pathway movement and others that kind of go to scale, if the scale innovation, I'd love for you to unpack a couple things around scale innovation, because clearly for scale innovation to happen, for people to take really good ideas to a place of broader impact, the policy set has to be there. You have to have state policies, federal reporting regimes, and others that will give you air cover to be able to do the support. Otherwise, you end up with the Census Day enrollment report is still more important than everything else, right? So talk a bit about how that catalytic work, because that can't all be done by the foundation. That's got to be done by leaders like these in the room, right? Making sure that the legislators and other people understand what needs to be measured.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing in places like Texas, in places like Ohio, in places like Washington, is where you have activated or energized higher ed communities. They're playing a much more significant role in policy making and forming policy. Ohio is a great example. Performance of, in this case, it'll be performance-based funding. When the state, rightly in my view, reached out to, it was Gordon Gee, who was then the chancellor at Ohio State University, and asked Gordon to bring together a consortium of higher ed, representing all segments, to hammer out an outcomes-based funding measurement model, one which comprehended the very significant differences between the Ohio States of the world and the Ohio community colleges. They didn't get it right. They'll be the first to tell you they didn't get it right in the first iteration, but they continue to improve it. And it's actually beginning to bear some fruit. We're seeing the same thing in Texas, where a Student Success Council, I think is what it's called, got together very successfully, has some support from Educate Texas. Initially was in the 2-year space, but it's broadened its purview and has had some significant impact in...
the whole performance-based model was based on the work of that for the state of Texas.
And so you see higher education as it begins to work in states in a way that's networked together, where, and it's tough because, you know, historically 2 and 4 year different segments are competing for scarce dollars. It's tough to sort of bring those groups together, but we are seeing in places where that's possible, where you're beginning to see network effects across the state, that the state higher education institutions are able to have an impact over the policy. And it stands to reason, right? No legislator in his or her right mind is going to try to legislate the measures of student outcomes. It's suicide. I mean, political suicide. So if there's a community of practitioners willing and engaged to turn to, the obvious thing is to turn to that community. And we're seeing that play out in state after state,
But those policy conversations are going to have real implications, in particular for the broader kinds of student sets that we're trying to bring in. So a good example is, you know, recently there's a lot of controversy, not really controversy, but conversations around time to degree, and people trying to put into college promise programs, you know, trying to support low-income students going through requirements that they have to, you know, complete 30 hours in a year. And many of these folks are folks who are in welfare programs that require them to work full-time. So they're saying to a returning woman with 3 kids that you have to work 40 hours or more, and you have to take 15 hours or more. And that reality is just hitting them between the eyes because those policy conversations haven't really kind of gotten together.
And it is one of these areas in which it's going to tug at the fabric of higher ed in terms of the way it's structured. It is going to require as much as possible of a uniform voice around some of the policy issues and the perverse effects that they may have. And there's a great example of one. I mean, I know we're going to talk about it. I'll jump there. I hope not ahead of time. You know, the power of networks in higher education and sort of supporting the kinds of transformation is just incredible. We see it in the University Innovation Alliance. We've seen it in the Completion by Design
Consortium here.
We saw this consortium here is an enormous amount of potential. You see the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities has just announced that it's going to establish a bunch of clusters and I think 100 institutions, you know, establishing them as networks. The opportunity to learn together. And I'd go back to your question about reach and impact at scale. You know, the way to not do that is hand-to-hand combat, or what we would refer to as hand-to-hand combat, one institution at a time. There's too many of them. There's 4,700. It's too long. So we're always looking for models that are more scalable. They have more impact. They have more reach. They move at a quicker pace. And the network model that takes a variety of different forms involves institutions like the ones in this room committing to learning together, committing to, and it's hard, showing each other their data, which is really hard because it's warts and all kind of stuff. Committed to sharing the hard lessons as well as the victories. You think about higher education conferences and you know, almost any variety. They are kind of dog and pony shows of success stories.
or proposed success,
Or
right?
right.
We're trying this, and that ends up being proposed of it. We rarely go to a conference where it's like, let's do the 10 things that did not work, right? And like, that's not the sessions we're going to, right?
We have Mark and I have a colleague in common, a woman named Suzanne Walsh. Some of you may know her. Who loves this idea of fail fest, which is when you get up and you give a presentation on something that went really badly wrong and why. And but that's important. And we're beginning to see in those networks, in that learning in public, we're beginning to see opportunities to accelerate the kind of the kind of learning.
Well, there's a combination of, I'd love for you to unpack this a bit. In that network work, there's a combination of practice stimulation, right? You get the creative competition of the network, really kind of working on practice, but you also get a collective voice.
Yeah,
you get a group of people who can go have a policy conversation as a collective, and what they can say is, okay, don't come down with policy recommendations that mandate practice. Come down with the right kind of air cover so we can innovate. You can hold us accountable all you want, but use these kinds of measures. And this is where it gets really important. If we don't get involved in defining the measures, they'll be defined for us. Right? And so kind of that's where these consortiums come together, because these kinds of collective voices help shape that.
Yeah,
right?
no, absolutely. I mean, there's so many affordances from consorting. First of all, scale matters. I mean, in a big way. So all the data that I looked at suggests that larger configurations of institutions do better by every measure. Student outcomes, educational expenditure per student, just scale matters. And of course, if you think about the scale that's available in consortia, right? Even in the little things like some of the shared service opportunities, some of the risk management opportunities. I came from the University of California, where it was 10 campuses, 220,000 students, 20 billion annual budget, and I shared a hallway with the woman who was hired to do risk management. And she was a very effervescent person who you couldn't help hear speaking on the phone even when your office doors were closed. But it was incredible what she was able to accomplish just by rationalizing the risk management insurance regimes existing across 10 campuses. We're talking tens of millions of dollars, right? And it was, and that's like a trivial example. I mean, it's not as interesting as payroll or other things you might do. So the opportunity, if you think about the opportunity in some of the back end stuff, which is pretty well documented in higher ed, what about the opportunity in the front end stuff? You know, in the less commonly taught courses, super difficult to maintain. But they need to be maintained for all sorts of good reasons, in defense of our cultural heritage, you know, in advocacy for our continued development of our cultural heritage. What about investment in real innovative science that requires significant platform, lab space, and very expensive people? It doesn't necessarily always make sense that these expenditures need to be uniquely afforded by individual campuses. In fact, increasingly, it makes less and less sense. And what configurations outside consortia and network can think radically differently about the evolution of the academic program.
And you see that with the National Science Foundation Centers of Excellence and some of that larger work. The idea of what can we're better together in that larger work. So here's the devil's advocate side, and I know you're passionate about this, so I want you to spend some time unpacking it for us. When you start going to scale, you get the law of large numbers. And if you haven't read Todd Rose's book, The End of Average, he really has some admonitions about being careful about the law of large numbers, because large numbers, you end up with a smoothing effect. And the smoothing effect of averages end up making, for example, pipelines through higher education seem a lot more linear than they actually are. When you actually study the journeys of students, they're a lot more jagged, right? Students have life experiences that knock them off course. They've got all kinds of issues that are happening. And one of the challenges we're seeing is as the push towards more completion and performance measures have gone up, we're seeing numbers tick up nationally around completion rates. People are taking it more seriously, and they're getting this, especially around transfer relationships and a host of others. But what we're not seeing the needle move on is the closing of attainment gaps. I mean, USF is a great example of a place that has really done just amazing work diving not just into completion, but really closing the equity gaps and driving. There were a lot of other people in the room who have been doing the same thing. But nationally, what we're seeing is a real challenge, this push towards completion. And I'm just going to say it bluntly, there are some people who will game the system and they'll optimize completion by actually lowering access to the hardest to serve students. And they'll design programs that only appeal to students that are heavily scaffolded second, third generation folks, as opposed to those returning adults and other folks. How are we going to wrestle with that as a field?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, there's a couple of things that I've seen. You know, one of them is outcomes-based funding formula that actually give bonuses for, you know, that you're using input-adjusted measures so that you're doing better than the predicted value given the students that you have. So that
especially if you care about social mobility, right?
So I think the data that Raj Chetty, on social mobility, the data that Raj Chetty and co. have published, which shows for every institution, you know, how able it is to move students through quintiles, you know, how many of their students are able to move from the lowest economic quintile to a higher one. And it's very public data. You can go out there and search it. You know, I think the availability of increasingly good consumer information sites and students, remember, are now becoming increasingly concerned about the cost of college. So I think there's a number of things that can help. I also think that there's a math problem that's at work. You know, and it goes something like this. There aren't enough rich white people left to fill all the seats in higher education. So, you know.
Or high school students just coming out of high school. Right.
And the adult marketplace is the place where we're going to need to look to fill a lot of spaces in many states, including this one. And that's a different student body. So there's a point at which, it's not true at every institution. I don't think Harvard feels this necessarily as painfully. But there's a point at which serving the underserved is not just the right thing to do, it's the only financially sane thing to do.
Right.
And it's a tough one because, and then I'll just be totally honest with you, the data show that that there is growth, incremental growth, in the number of students who are able to pay full freight at private, out-of-state public institutions. So there is opportunity, and the number of highly selective institutions has grown. The number of seats, if you think about it in terms of capacity as well as institutions, has grown over the past couple of decades. And the question, and it's a tough question for every institution, certainly every institution in this room, it's really hard to put up your hand and say, that's probably not us.
Yeah.
Because there is a statistical chance that it could be. You know, and then you could go underneath what it would take to get there. And it's usually measured in dollars and cents, and it's usually an unrealistic number. And it usually requires grossly unrealistic assumptions about the extent and nature and price point of your student market. But it's a first mover problem. In this industry, which rewards exclusivity, it is hard to say, I'm not going in that direction. My future is there.
It's also a rewards issue because if, you know, for example, the changes in IPEDS that just finally took it, you know, let people count transfer students, let people count returning students in a different way.
Yeah.
You as an institution were getting beaten up for IPEDS report. We were forced to focus on first-time, full-time fall freshmen from high school, which, like you said, is a diminishing market. It's not there, and you've got a giant adult market, 35 million adults with some college and no credential that are eager to be served, and you have the part-time and the returning adults.
Yeah.
If you don't get, again, to serve all students, you have to see all students. If you're not allowed to report your successes, higher education's moved generally by regulations, resources, and reputation, right? And if you can't get reputational bump by your success with the reporting, and the regulations don't have anything to do with that population, you're not going to spend time on that population.
Tough call. Although I'm becoming increasingly fond of CFOs because the CFO will know. And one in particular, Teresa Harding used to be the CFO at Dell State University, and I remember in a meeting with her saying, you know, does she know how much it costs to acquire a student? And the answer was to a penny. And then I asked, did she know how long that student had to be retained in order for them to recoup that investment? And the answer was to the week in the third term, the third semester. You know, so you know, she knew the cost and benefit of retaining that student by week over and above, right? So the ability to understand the economics of retention is really a powerful.
We've seen that with the Civitas data around. We have a number of institutions that are totally focused on the front door, and they've been focused on all the intake part of the funnel and getting students through the first 3 semesters. And we've shown institutions, in fact, we're going to do a community insights report on this soon, about the notion of the finish line. We showed them you have a whole group of students that are close to the finish line, where if you put a little bit of effort there, you actually are going to have huge return on investment for that. So part of it's getting your arms around the data to be able to have this conversation. But I think what's pretty clear, though, is I think the closing the gaps conversation is going to be a major emphasis for the next few years.
It is, and I don't think we know enough about it, or rather, I think the data we publish are good. I mean, the Lumina report just came out the other day, showed the kind of results that you had described. I think it is important for us to go deeper. There are grosser, often more insidious inequities. So, for example, if you look at the programs, the majors that are, go into high-earning professions, nursing, engineering, and you look at the racial composition of the student enrollment, even in schools which are minority-serving institutions, that they will, if you go into a minority-serving institution which is predominantly non-white, and you look over at the nursing school, it's just a different complexion. And that would be true in engineering and other places. So you've got these internal inequities, which are also problematic. If you look at the balance between, social sciences, if you look where transfer students tend to cluster, there are pathways that are closed off, so that the numbers that we show in attainment gap are probably better than the underlying reality.
Right. The whole notion of making big data small, at some point you have to kind of get to the small data to be able to understand what's happening in that. Well, that brings up another conversation I'd love to have, because there seems, because of this energy around closing equity gaps, people are beginning to kind of wrap their arms around the notion of huge swaths of students with housing insecurity, food insecurity, the work of Sarah Goldrick-Rab in paying the price. And I think there's a whole wave of affordability innovations that are happening, whether it's College Promise, the work of open education resources to lower the cost of textbooks, emergency aid. I'd love for you to talk a bit about where you see that going in the few years to come.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, and it's also sad. I mean, it's almost sad that we have to have this conversation about food insecurity amongst, but we do, and it's a very important conversation. Housing insecurity. And there's a couple things. So one of them is it puts a huge amount of pressure on colleges to provide social services they're not equipped to provide. Just saying that. This is at a time when we're looking at the pretty fundamental retooling of our advising or student supports. So that you're looking to your student supports to provide, mental health services, career counseling, academic advising, and general student support.
Or at minimum, reach out to the local social services that can help in that. So part of it is not just providing it all, but actually being synchronized in terms of that, right?
Engaging, and so you're seeing, we often talk about the sort of major transformations that we're seeing happen in the teaching profession. I wouldn't want to undersell the major transformations we're seeing in the advising professions to cope with a fundamentally different range of needs. So I think that's one thing, some internal structural issues. And of course, those surrounding supports aren't necessarily as good in a rural place in South Dakota as they might be in an urban place in Florida. So context, again, is everything. Second point I guess I'd raise is the College Promise programs, which are, who can object to lowering the cost that students have to pay for college? I'm going to admit to being a little skeptical. I always think it's important to attack debt and student burden. But I'm going to admit to being skeptical for two reasons. The first is some of the data that I've seen, Oregon's an interesting example, demonstrate that the real benefit is going to middle class kids. It's great, and I understand why. That's where the voters are, cynically. And everybody, middle class kids are also stretched. But if you look at the data in Oregon, the Promise program has a disproportional benefit.
For middle class.
And so the students who are meant to be served aren't being served. Now, that's not true of all programs, but I would want to know a lot more about the programs that are out there. So that's thing one. Thing two is that not all these programs are the same, and I don't think we have a very good taxonomy. So, for example, if you look at Chicago, which has a scholarship for students achieving it's a merit-based scholarship, so it's free college if you get above whatever it is, GPA, or the Hope Scholarship in Georgia. They both have perverse equity impacts, right? Because they're largely dealing with...
And that's part of the challenge of us having an ecosystem of higher ed funding models, right, across the United States, so they're very different. But it's pretty clear people are trying to learn what works.
That's right.
Right? They're
That's
trying
right.
to figure out
And
what
that's the good
works.
thing.
And even, there's the big levers like College Promise, but there's small levers like emergency aid,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So after the Harvey hurricane, Civitas was a part of joining the work with the Texas higher education community, and they put together, a large fund that actually went out to emergency aid for Harvey victims.
Yeah.
And part of it was get them that aid quickly and help them see this as a sign that people love and want you to succeed on this kind of pathway if they were being hit hard. But it's the realization, we've seen this in our colleges, is when they get the data that shows them that 40 to 45% of your students who are leaving in solid academic standing. They're 3.0 to 4.0. They're leaving for life and logistics issues, and the right kind of aid at the right time, or the right outreach at the right time. And that's where the small stuff comes in, right?
Yeah, super helpful. But some of these, these are great examples of issues that I think need to be debated in public. I'll give you two more just because they're really disturbing. The first is Sandy Baum, who will say, wait a minute, if I'm a low-income student, aren't I better off going into debt, taking on $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 worth of debt to go to a school where I have an 87% chance of graduating than I am of taking on $20,000 worth of debt and going to school where I have a 20% chance of graduating? Now, that is a moral choice. That is it's a major issue to resolve. And, statistically, she's probably right. The human cost of getting it wrong, if you're the student who went for the 50,000 and wasn't one of the 87%, is super high. But these are really important questions that I think need to be debated pretty vigorously in public. I think the other is I have never been super keen on solving this higher ed challenge on the revenue side, because I think it diminishes the incentives to actually improve the performance inside the college. It's been a revenue-driven model. It's been an enrollment-driven model for 40 or 50 years, and that has led to an industry which is focused on access, has focused on enrollment census day. If I saw college promise programs that were tied rigorously to, your college will benefit from a college promise type scholarship program if and only if it meets the following standards in terms of its student care and support. Now that's an interesting idea, where you're tying success and access together in a policy regime.
Yeah, part of the challenge, of course, is the classic public good versus private good conversation, right? And the reason this has probably come to a fever pitch is we've had this giant shift of public good funding into private good funding, where federal has shifted to states, states have now shifted to local tax bases, where community colleges have shifted to tuition, right? And so you've seen this massive increase based on that, and so the burden falling to the student at a time when affordability is becoming more of an issue because you have more low-income students coming in. This is going to be the conversation probably for the next 5 to 7 years.
No, I think that's right, and and ultimately, and you see it play out in poll after poll. You're seeing it play out in the political discourse, which is, higher education is getting caught up in the culture wars in a way which is not very pleasant. Where 58% of Republicans in a recent Pew survey see college as a net negative for the country. And repeated polling on this kind of issue. And my friends from Gallup tell me that once an issue gets caught up in the culture wars, it's hard to extract it from the jaws.
Pull it out.
And I'm like, I hope that's not true. I think it's something that we're going to have to contend with, and I think we're going to have to contend with in terms of the kinds of supports and services that we offer to students, to demonstrate that the value of higher education is more than just an abstraction, that it is actually real and tangible, and that the cost is worth it. And that's going to, I think, require a different way of engaging with the public. I see this a lot in terms of higher education leadership engaging with policymakers, and one, my impression is sometimes the higher ed leaders, they're talking at very different levels at cross purposes. And the response of higher education leadership sometimes appears to me to be, we'll just speak louder and more slowly. That never worked to me for me when I was living abroad in a country that I didn't speak the language, and I'm not sure it's working necessarily all that well in higher ed. So I think we're going to have to double down on rethinking how to articulate our value in a way which is instantly accessible to all Americans including Trump America.
Yeah, and the idea of and being authentic about it in terms of how it can be received by different audiences, right? For that to be able to pull together. And part of that challenge is trying to get to students early to help them understand. And you know, for example, a lot of the pathway movement is talking about people are getting to college and they've been sold from an early age, you know, if you want to have opportunity, go to college, go to college, go to college. And by the time they get to college, they don't know what that means. They want to go to college, but then they're not thinking about the specific program they're going into, their kind of economic choices and that. Part of this is us, you know, having this broader conversation about this generation is going to be living learning, right? So I've been making the case recently that we should end the term lifelong learning. Lifelong learning makes it sound like you're doing episodic bouts of learning. And we're now in a world of living learning. You know, all of us with, you know, young children. I have a 9-year-old. My wife the other day, I'm on the road a lot. My wife called me freaking out about the garbage disposal. She just started yelling that we're just gonna have to buy a new garbage disposal. This thing is not working. She was really upset. And I told her about the button on the bottom. The button on the bottom didn't work, and we're having this whole conversation. And my 9-year-old in the background is yelling at us. He goes, put a stick in it. We're like, what? He goes, no, put a stick in it. And we're like, what are you talking about? In the middle of our conversation, he had gone to YouTube and looked up how to fix the garbage disposal. He had looked up that brand, and he got a YouTube instructional video about the fact you take a broom handle and you go in and you turn it one crank, and that'll fix the garbage disposal. And he goes, here, Mom, watch. And he had her watch the video, and she goes, Mark, what should I do? It says I'm supposed to. I said, try it. And she put it in there, bang, garbage disposal was fixed. And it was just, you know, the whole notion of, you know, the living learning at their fingertips all the time. The generation that's coming is going to be in this learning swirl, right? This living learning world. And part of what we have to do is figure out how do we get them on these pathways where they're continuously learning and understanding the value of it. It goes back to, you know, where we began the session talking about Warren Buffett's gift. Warren Buffett is fond of saying, you know, the best investment you can make is not his stock, right? The best investment you can make is in a young person's education. Right? When you look at the final return on the investment, and part of our work is going to be that kind of advocacy, right? So what do you think, I know that part of the conversation at the foundation has been more and more about the kind of K-20 landscape, P16, P20, whatever you want to call it. How much of that work is, I know in the lunch session we're going to be talking about a kind of an ecosystem database conversation. We've been doing work with Metro Dallas, with Metro Cleveland, connecting data from K-12 into higher education and looking at the pathways of students as they go into the world of work. Tell me what you think about that kind of work going forward, because clearly the episodic lifelong learning spaces, we have to start thinking about the lifespan, right? And how this is going to work.
I can tell you the areas that we're sort of in this exploratory phase, which will usually go on for a year, maybe 2 years before figuring out where, if anywhere, there's a role for the foundation in terms of investing. But the areas that we're looking at, that's certainly one of them. Longitudinal data sets, which are intrinsically local, which connect student data and employment data. And partly because they get at the pathways. You can see better where the pathways are and are not working, and you can kind of adjust accordingly. It also gets back to that point about, what does it mean to be nimble in terms of changing economic demand? There's some really interesting opportunities in the data space as well, because we tend to use formalized, data systems, data sources for those kinds of analyses. We're probably underutilizing the opportunities at Burning Glass and LinkedIn, where you have very different views of competencies as available and competencies as required in the labor market. And so it's an interesting opportunity to compare the analyses that you get using the formalized databases versus the ones you get using these sort of vast social media engines. So that's one area. I think the other related is what does it mean for a community, and I won't put geographic boundaries, it could be a state, it could be a region, it could be a city, to actually think in terms of an educational pathway that goes from P16, from school into work, across that whole arc. What does it look like? How do the different governing structures interact with each other? What are the kind of data systems that are put in place? How are employers engaged? What does the community do in order to connect employers to the educational pipeline so that students can be pulled through more effectively and more with, so that's sort of a second area. I think the third, which is the one that fills me with, I'm kind of overwhelmed by it, is, what can you do to improve education workforce connectivity? I mean, it does get back to the original question about education for what. And that's challenging. it's challenging at any number of levels. First of all, because it's now all the rage. It reminds me of MOOCs in 2012. It's all the, it's kind of a fad to talk about education workforce connectivity. And so sort of sifting through the faddishness for those nuggets of insight are really...
I still remember Dan and I were in a meeting where the speakers were literally making the case that MOOCs were going to save higher ed.
Yeah.
And we just had a moment where we looked at each other, kind of, oh my gosh, like the statement of this. But that's where people they think there's like one silver bullet.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about these larger kind of ecosystem conversations across multiple providers, you realize this is a pretty going to be a pretty important large scale conversation about where we're going to go. A good example is the pathway movement in community colleges. And one of the things we've been saying to the pathway folks is, one, you've got to design those pathways based on your data, not just on national best practices. Think about what your data are about, and then you got to test them to see whether or not they're working.
Right.
A part of testing is understanding where do the students come from to get on that pathway, and are you connected to that? And then if you're a community college, every single one of your pathways should be 100% transferable to a bachelor's degree program if that's what the intention of that pathway is. And they haven't had that conversation to think about, does this whole thing transfer? Because what's interesting is a lot of them transfer, but they don't apply. Right? So you get credits that transfer, but not all the credits apply, and so they end up losing credits. And in our state, in the state of Texas, it's like the worst kept secret is the average associate's degree graduate leaves with an associate's degree that's supposed to be 60 to 63 hours. They leave with 93 credits.
Oh, wow.
And you think, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that everything transfers, but it doesn't necessarily apply. And that's where this ecosystem conversation, if you want to get over equity gaps and affordability issues, we actually kind of have to, this consortium is phenomenal, but it's like that consortium's got to continue to expand, right?
Well, and then the other thing about, come back to the consortium, the other thing that's become a personal fascination for me is that, so how are we going to do all this? Who is going to do all this? It isn't clear to me, and this is without being at all critical of the higher education establishment, we're talking about change management on a massive scale. Yeah. We're talking about access to arcane sources of expertise. That doesn't make them bad. It's just how to build an effective transfer pathways is not something everybody's got in their back pocket. Or how to work with industry in order to identify competencies that industry will actually employ and then back map those competencies into a degree program so that it can, these are specialist skills, right? So you've got a combination of highly specialized skills where there is evidence-based practice, that's the good news, coupled with the need for pretty sophisticated enterprise change management capability. And that is not something that the industry is known for. And it isn't also clear to me that we have the drivers that were available in healthcare. The drivers that were available in healthcare were the massive Medicare and Medicaid, just the massive amounts of federal funding. So the feds could say, we're making this switch in the way we're using federal dollars in support of healthcare. The industry had no choice. Even if you look at the scale of public investment in higher education, there's nothing like the leverage in those dollars that there is in healthcare. Then you look across the societies that we all belong to and the associations that we all belong to, where there's great sources of expertise and innovation, but there's virtually nothing in the way of programmatic supports that can touch down on your campus or in your consortium and provide the careful support through a change management process. There are people who will do it, and there are firms that will do it, but remember, we're talking about scaled application. 4,700, Title IV eligible institutions in this country. All right, let's say not all of them should or deserve to survive or whatever. Just narrow the number a little bit. Still a big task, right? So there's this interesting question about where do those change supports come from, and where does the human capital, where does the human talent come from? Where's the pipeline that's going to help us build and continue this movement? And so again, the cost of generating that talent is the ability to release people's time to developing it, because these are not unacquirable skills. They're highly acquirable skills, and there's plenty of literature and plenty of support to help get them. It is finding the platform that enables N number of individuals to go out, become competent, come back, train others. That's hard to do in a college of 2,000.
And also build a culture of R&D, right?
Yeah.
The idea where you're actually doing the R&D work of using data to frame what you're doing, but testing and trying and guiding the change management process in,
Yeah.
that process. So with that said, obviously big tasks, big goals, trying to get the students, especially trying to close equity gaps and trying to deal with affordability. When you look at the road ahead, what has you excited? What kind of new things do you see on the road ahead that have you kind of jazzed up for the possibilities?
So I think we've mentioned a couple of them. I think the power of networks as agents of change is huge.
Yeah.
And whether they're networks formed out of consortia or whether they're institutions that come together just because their chancellors had dinner, like the University Innovation Alliance, or whether they're systems that have
Natural connections.
Natural connections. I think we're seeing the potential to generate that kind of talent and self-learning and to accelerate the kind of change. I think that's hugely exciting.
There's a lot of better together energy, right, where people are figuring it out. Yeah.
I think the increasing availability of know-how. It's no longer it's no longer what to do or how to do it. It's
It's
the
how to
real
scale.
question. Yeah, the real question is why aren't you doing it? I mean, there it is. What's holding you back, right? And those are hard conversations because they force a kind of reflection. Some of the tools that I've seen which enable institutions to actually reflect on their strengths and weaknesses and then have those conversations about where they want to lean in. I think that's really exciting. I think this workforce, I think the political challenges that we face trying to rescue the public's trust in higher education is probably the biggest existential threat we've experienced in the last 100 years. I don't actually think it's a slam dunk, this one, because I think the forces of doubt are powerful, vocal. They have access to media which doesn't care about all the things we care about, like fact and evidence.
That gives you latitude for opportunity and argument, right?
It does.
If you don't have to deal with facts, you can make all kinds of cases.
But it is going to require us to tell our story differently. So I think I'm excited about in a perverse sort of way. I'm excited about that. To me, I think that's our biggest challenge.
No, what's exciting about that is it's actually a chance for us to hone the argument about our value proposition in a way that we're going to have to be far more sensitive to sanctimony and aristocracy.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of education arguments, and I hear it all the time when you go into rural communities, you go into inner city communities, is they really feel like a lot of the higher education arguments are filled with both sanctimony, we're doing the work of God, you should give us whatever you have, or aristocracy, it's elitism. And I think the more we can kind of hone our arguments around the notion of giving people the power to have the trajectory, to guide the trajectory of their own lives, that's a very different conversation.
Yeah, and I think another challenge in that is going to be, and it's going to be essential, it's not to be apologist. It's to say, this stuff, some of it's not going so well, here's how. And here's how we're going to fix it. There's certain areas where we have been underperforming. And being able to embrace that, and doing that in a very public way, in a very humble way, in a way that can cultivate, again, a broader support. Recognizing that that the political tenor of this country is incredibly divisive, and that if we are true to our roots, we can create the commons where people with different perspectives can come together and begin to generate an understanding of each other. That's going to require a huge shift in the tone and mentality in higher education, which I don't underestimate the complexity of what I say, but the opportunity is there. It's going to require a return into the public discourse of higher education leadership, which has more or less disappeared, with a couple of exceptions.
Well, just if you think about the opportunity of this, we were just day before yesterday with the South African delegation at Achieving the Dream at the Nashville Public Library Civil Rights Room. If you haven't had a chance to visit the Civil Rights Room at Nashville Public Library, wow, it is. I mean, the collection is pretty amazing. And one of the things that was great about that larger conversation was they had these giant pictures on the wall of the lunch counters and of the, blocking the schoolways and especially the sit-ins in Nashville and the work that they did. And one of the things they were pointing out, and they had this big round table with the 10 rules for passive resistance that were put together by the organizers in Nashville, and they had you read the rules out. And one of the things that the presenter was talking about was every single one of these rules you're reading right now were written and agreed to by a group of 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. Yeah. All the people you see on those lunch counters are 17, 18, 19 years old. These are young people who have the chance to change the world with the right kind of, again, the right kind of power and the right kind of voice. You know, we have the chance to be a part of that generation and help catalyze that generation. That's what gets exciting about this, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about that ability to kind of touch that generation and kind of make this work, and you think about the role of both networks and foundations in kind of doing that work, talk a bit about how you think going forward we have to kind of embrace that role and be okay being a bit, like you were saying, being a champion of the education world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the data are still on our side, as far as anybody cares. That the value return from a degree is high. The premium, the wage premium is, I don't know, 80-something%. I think we have to own the fact that it's not uniformly available to all students, that it is particularly available to white students of privilege, and that students of color, first-gen adult students, low-income students are significantly disadvantaged, and that we have to own that and understand the paths for improving upon that. I think there's good, I think there is real merit in saying that and standing up to that. And embracing it as a kind of a mission orientation. And I want to underscore the other point I made earlier, is that it's not just, it is the right thing to do. There's no doubt about it, and that should be the primary motivation. It certainly is for me. But if you look at the demographics of the country, you look at the demographics of the region, you look at the cost of higher education, fundamental reform of the business is the only financially viable thing to do. And that entails doing things completely differently and doing it with completely new or different student populations with whom we do not yet have a fundamental core competency. So you've got this wonderful moment where the right thing to do and the financially sane thing to do actually come together, which I think is kind of, powerful potentially.
Take advantage of it.
Yeah, take advantage of it. It may not last forever.
Yeah, that's a neat thing. So the world that we're going to move into is a world where education is more important than ever before. And in that world, we need leaders who are going to, kind of ring the bell and sound the charge for this kind of work. So it's actually been just an amazing pleasure to have you at the Gates Foundation doing this work for the time you've been there. And now as you get ready for your next adventure and that work, I know you're going to continue to ring the bell and sound the charge in this larger work. And we just can't thank you enough for all you've done, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, we are adjourned, and we will look forward to watching you continue this conversation in the conference to come. Thanks, everybody.